Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Endurance School's Detention. We are really excited to be joined here tonight by Cody Beals, who we're going to hear a little bit more about from Chris in a second. But I just wanted to say hi and thank you for joining us this Tuesday evening.
Hey, great to be here with you guys.
Cody Beals, for those of you guys that don't know him, he is a professional Canadian triathlete. He lives in Guelph, Ontario. He has 670.3 wins to his name and 3 Ironman championships, and also is the champion of Challenge Aruba and way too many other races in Canada to count. Not just a triathlete or an athlete, Cody also has a degree in physics from Queen's University, and it gets even better where he graduated at the top of his class. Cody is a true Renaissance man. He's an avid book reader, plays the piano, loves synth waves, loves synthwave, and can converse with physicists. Cody Beals, welcome to Detention.
Wow. Can I get you to write my memoir? That was one hell of an introduction.
I'm really excited about this interview now, having heard that again. That's fascinating.
I'm excited. I want to meet this guy. I don't know him.
Sounds great.
One of the best compliments I ever got was one of my friends said, "I would like for you to introduce me sometime."
Yes. Wow. I can see why.
So how are you doing, man? We started this show a lot because of everything that's changed in the world, and you and I have talked a few times throughout the spring. I kind of ping you for Wadi Inc. content every 6 weeks or so. But how are you holding up in this very strange 2020?
Good. Initially I wouldn't have said, that wouldn't have been my answer. It was kind of rough. I was feeling pretty down about everything. It felt like the rug got pulled out from underneath me. Obviously, the world is in the throes of much bigger problems than just a pro triathlete season getting upended. But when it's your livelihood and your full-time thing, it was disturbing, to say the least, to have all your carefully laid plans snatched from you. So that took a while to adjust from. And as the weeks turned into months, I basically had to find other ways to occupy myself, other things to focus on. Because I've increasingly lost confidence we'll be doing any racing at all this year. So I guess the question is, how much of my identity is wrapped up in pro triathlon, and how else can I diversify my life to find my kicks elsewhere?
That's a great. I love that you brought up the fact about like how much of your identity is caught up in triathlon. What have you discovered in answering that question? How much is wrapped up in professional triathlon for you?
At times, too much, to be honest. But I think it's good. Like, I've had upheaval in my life in the past that's kind of made me question that. And again, you can't be married to the sport. You can't be, totally committed to it 24/7, even if you want to be at your very best. It's kind of counterintuitive. I think a lot of people buy into this narrative of like the pro triathlete who has this monk-like existence, who only lives for the sport. But in my experience, to be at your best as a professional athlete, that's not the kind of life you need to lead. Like, some amount of balance is just absolutely necessary. So, having been periodically kind of reacquainted with that lesson, it hasn't hit me as hard as it would have compared to me at, say, age 20, just getting into the sport, when that was like all that was going on in my life. So thankfully, I have a wonderful relationship I'm in. I've got some good friends I'm actually spending a week at the cottage with. I've got an old house to fix up. I've got my piano to dust off. Like, there's a whole bunch of other things going on, even when triathlon is not necessarily producing the most fun in my life right now.
So as this period starts to stretch on, and that pandemic period that we thought was going to be a few weeks to a month starts to be obviously going to be a little bit longer, how has your thinking about this time changed? How have you evolved your approach to existing in this period?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I guess I could tackle that from a lot of different standpoints. From a training standpoint, it's been really interesting because we've basically been on the cusp of racing now for several months. Like, the races have been canceled on kind of a rolling basis, always a couple months in advance. So my play, initially I just took some downtime because I know from experience I can't hold peak form from like March through to December when I might be racing. Usually I call my season in November, but this year it's conceivable I could even race Kona in February if that even happens. Mm-hmm. So after that downtime, I've kind of just been in like what I'd call a holding pattern, where I'm staying 4 to 6 weeks out from peak fitness at all times. So on one hand, it's kind of a weird limbo to be in. It's a lot of uncertainty to deal with. On the other hand, the positive slant on it is that it allows me to do a lot of fun training. Basically, I'm cutting out the 5 to 10% of training that you grind through in the 6 weeks leading up to a race that's kind of miserable. And I'm just sticking with sessions that I actually enjoy for the most part. So I'm actually at a little cottage week / training camp with my good friends Jackson Laundry and Taylor Reed this week. And so, we're going to push ourselves hard, but we're not going to go crazy as if we were building into a race right now.
So if you wouldn't mind talking about it, so you just said the sessions you enjoy versus like the sessions that are really hard in the final 6 weeks before leading into a race. What does that look like for you right now? Like, what is the training that you enjoy doing? And then if you could walk through, like, how does your training shift in those 6 weeks going into a race?
Sure. So I guess one of the biggest, most notable changes is that I haven't been doing almost any indoor training. So I kind of got this reputation as someone who did like most of their training indoors. The pro who did like, 12 hours a week on the trainer every week kind of thing. Our pools have been closed since March. I haven't had access to a treadmill since March. I used to do upwards of a half my running on the treadmill. So suddenly I had this shift where like all my training is outside now, and I'm really enjoying it. Like I'm 7 years into my pro career, and the routine was getting a little bit stale at times, frankly. And it's been really cool now to just have like this change kind of forcibly imposed on me, but it's been awesome. So I actually have a road bike for the first time in I'm gonna say 6 or 7 years, and I built it up with 32 millimeter tires. So I'm rediscovering all these roads around my place that just were inaccessible on my tri bike that I could ride. It was basically gravel bike now. So it's really breathed new life and enthusiasm into this like tired old routine. Same with my swimming. I've been doing all my swimming open water, and I've also really embraced doing a lot more group training. So in the past, I had like my carefully scripted plan, and I felt like I had to do everything on my own in order to hit those numbers and be really disciplined with intensity. And training with other people too often kind of pushed me too hard at the wrong times. This year, there's a lot more leeway. Like, I might have an outline for what my week's going to look like, but if my buddy Jack or Taylor calls me up and says, hey, this is my work today, chances are I'm in a meeting point where we can compromise, even if it's exactly what I need to be doing. So that's been a really nice evolution. I mean, the way it would change, if I was going to start targeting, say, an Ironman in September, well, for example, last year, leading into Ultra Mont Kona, I think I did 12 6-hour rides in my grungy basement on the trainer. So, I mean, there's kind of like a perverse satisfaction in getting those done, taking those off, but I'd be lying to say they're fun. So I'm not going to be missing those, I guess, to put it gently.
So what has getting away from that prescriptive indoor training given to you? What do you feel like you've gained from getting outside of those perfect number boxes?
Just some fresh enthusiasm for the sport. So like I was this guy who did all his training indoors, super data driven, always scripted, always by the numbers. It's just, I almost had forgotten how to go out on a road bike without a computer, without power, and just, smell the roses a little bit more. It's not to say I'm going a lot easier or something, although I probably am a little bit. It's just kind of, training has become less like work and more like fun again, which is a really positive thing. I think to have longevity in the sport, you got to know how to have fun. So one of the guys I trained with, Andrew York, who is a Canadian Olympian in Brazil, had the privilege to train with him a little bit. When he was asked like what's the most important lesson from the sport, he'd always reply like, oh, you just have to have fun. That's the most important thing. And I always thought that was like a cop out of an answer, but the deeper I get in my pro career, the more I realized even if you do have like these lofty ambitions of crushing it at Kona and winning Ironmans and stuff, and making a lot of money or whatever lights your fire, you still have to be having fun. It's just simply too miserable. The financial rewards are inadequate. You can't find another way to push yourself in this sport if you're not going to be having fun. Maybe not every single session, but at least on average over the course of months and years and seasons.
So how are you going to take that from this period now? Because, we don't have races. There's a little bit of that stress taken away that we talked to Paula Finley last week, and she sort of said something similar where she's like, oh, that stress of having an impending race isn't kind of forcing me to do things. How are you going to take this, like the aspects of this attitude that you value into your training when like races do recommence at some point in the future?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I'm going to have to let the dust settle in this whole period and kind of reflect back on it before I really realize what were the positives from this period and what were the things that I should leave behind. So I don't really have a great answer on that right now. I think for sure I'll maintain more outdoor training, more group training, less pool swimming. Like I was of the mentality that I had to be in the pool like 6 times a week, or all my hard-won work would just be out the window. It's honestly not been that bad. Like at first, I was out of the water for maybe 6 or 7 weeks, with our pools being closed here and the water being too cold to open water swim. Finally, I got in someone's 14-meter backyard pool, so like a 15-yard backyard pool, tons of flip turn practice, and then finally open water. And like that hiatus, I would have thought at one point that would be like 2 years of swimming out the window, just total setback. It's just not been that bad. So I think going forward, I'll probably swim less. I'll probably swim more open water, and I'll definitely do more training outside. Those are obvious lessons from this period.
Tell us a little bit about what some of those 12 6-hour trainer rides are like. Are they just straight zone two power work? Are they intervals? Are they Ironman intensity? Like what are those composed of?
That's a great question. So I put a lot of thought into these. You know, I love my zone two. We were talking about that before we went live. So my training is very, very heavy on the zone two. So typically, the first few of those rides might be just steady, just complete the distance. Kind of lower to mid zone two. So for me, usually 220 to 235 watts kind of range. So the kind of power that feels great for 2 hours, feels fine for 4 hours, feels uncomfortable for six.
Yeah.
Sometimes downright miserable if you don't get your fueling right. I'd progress though to adding what I call end lifted components to the long rides. So lifting the power at the end. And usually the way I do that is through like threshold intervals and or high cadence intervals in the last 2 hours or even the last hour. So sometimes I try for 5 hours and then do 6 to 10 by 4 minutes at threshold, or even a VO2 piece in the last hour. Alternately, you could kind of keep power pretty even, just zone two, but instead lift your cadence up from say 60 or 70 RPM, which I grind away at for that time, to like 110 RPM, which looking at heart rate is a pretty similar stress to actually doing a piece of threshold, even though you're not lifting your power. And I can get into the reasons why I would do that cadence set or that power, but the long story short is that I find it's way more bang for your buck. So if I do a VO2 or a threshold set on fresh legs, I need to complete almost twice as many intervals to get the same fitness adaptation, just anecdotally based on what I've observed. If I do that late into a long ride when I'm already so fatigued, I find I just get way more adaptation as a result. So I actually do like startlingly little intensity in an Ironman block, but it's very very precisely planned at key times like that. I think also you can't two other benefits from that. It forces you to fuel really well, so you can't be neglecting nutrition if you're going to be smashing it in the last hour of a 6-hour ride. So it forces you to practice your Ironman nutrition and acclimate your gut, and it also forces you to focus mentally. Even if you have the fitness, it still requires a big component of just mental focus in order to push yourself like that after a lot of fatigue.
What's the adaptation you're after with the higher cadence or the higher intensity work? Is it a muscle fiber adaptation that you're trying to get after that late in the ride?
Yeah, so my former coach, David Tilbury Davis, who I consulted with for years, and he coached me on a full-time basis before that, he could probably comment more articulately on this. But my understanding is that it basically increases fatigue resistance when you have a broader range of cadences at your disposal. So different cadences might attack different muscle fibers. And so I think one of the pitfalls of doing a lot of indoor training is that you can lock yourself into a tiny little cadence window. And I've done this in the past where, I was doing all my training between like 65 and say 78 RPM or something like that. Then you go outside all of a sudden, and especially on a course like Mont Tremblant, which I'm pretty familiar with, there's all these rolling climbs and descents and stuff, and you're forced into a much wider cadence range. And if you're not used to that, if you haven't adapted to that, it's tough. So the easy way is to go out and ride in the mountains or the hills if you're on Ontario. If you're going to do a lot of riding in the trainer out of necessity here in Canada, where we've got 6 months of winter practically, you have to introduce components like that. So even if hills aren't forcing you out of your cadence range, I find there's just a gradual shift in cadence over the course of a ride anyway. Typically in an Ironman, I see a progression from higher to lower cadence, which I think is pretty representative of most athletes. So if I've trained that entire cadence range, I think I can stave off fatigue a little bit longer than if I was locked into one cadence the entire ride. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the coach-athlete relationship is something that we talk about a lot, unsurprisingly, since Chris and I are both coaches. And you just mentioned the coach that you've worked with. And I know that you've described that relationship as being like first really highly guided and then more collaborative. Can you tell us a little bit about how that relationship evolved and how it navigated in that direction? That's something we're hoping that that all of our athletes are able to do. That kind of empowerment is really hard to accomplish.
Sure, yeah. So David found me when he was living down in Texas. He's now back in the UK, which is home for him. And I think it was 2014 or 15. And at the time, I'd been self-coaching for years. So I'd been a varsity runner in university and then progressed to triathlon and had some results in spite of what I was doing, I would say. So I was still kind of in the throes of an eating disorder. I was overtraining like crazy. My hormonal profile was in shambles. If you're familiar with relative energy deficiency in sport, kind of a newly coined term for a syndrome of kind of catch-all group of symptoms. I was like a textbook case of Reds. So things really weren't going well, and I was basically on a short track towards a premature end of my career. So David found me and has kind of inserted himself into my life, and he had to kind of court me very aggressively to convince me that I needed a coach. I was still like so stubborn about this. I still thought I could do it all myself, be a self-taught expert, and like everything to do with triathlon. And I'm really glad he was persistent because he convinced me to work with him. And that was kind of the beginning of me finding my way out of a lot of these really negative practices that were sort of self-destructive. So working with David, he coached me on a full-time basis for I think 3 or 4 years, and that was really important. Like basically, I'd been self-coaching, I had some success, so I convinced myself it was okay, but I was making all these mistakes. I needed to hand over the reins to someone else. I needed to just fire myself and let David take over everything. After a few years, though, I felt like I kind of gained enough maturity and perspective and self-awareness to again take over a little bit more control. So gradually that kind of shifted more to a mentorship type capacity where I would write my training, which I really think is the easy part once you have some experience. Like that basically writes itself at this stage of my career. And David would help more with the overarching principles like periodization, season planning, sports psychology, managing mental health, like a lot. He'd wear a lot more hats than just your typical program writer coach. So that worked well for a while, but I think so we parted ways at the end of last year on really good terms. I had like the utmost respect for that guy. If I went back to a coach, it would likely be him. Uh, I think what was difficult about that is that I was neither of us was coaching per se. I was shirking the responsibility of coaching myself, and David was only really a mentor. That was all I was paying him for. So no one was really holding me to the level of accountability that I needed. And that's why that relationship eventually fell flat. I also realized there are some real limitations to distance coaching. So I think David, I hold him in very high esteem. He's a world-class coach, but even a coach, many rungs down the ladder in terms of experience and knowledge, who's local, who can see me and look me in the face, I think that's just really invaluable. So even my training partners, Jack and Taylor in the cottage there, they're not professional coaches necessarily, but they can just look me in the face some days and say, Cody, you look like shit. Like, why are you going to go on with this track session today? Like, go home and take a nap. So I think that kind of feedback at the elite level in particular is just so valuable, and it's so difficult for a coach who's only seeing your training peaks to be able to provide.
What are some of the tells that you have when you are exhausted or not going to be functioning well in a training session? Like when Jackson or Taylor see, like, what do they see when they can tell that you're not any good? And what do you see in them when you're like, hey, you're going to be terrible today?
Oh, it's so many things. It's hard to even put your finger on. For me in particular, my face starts to look awful. Like I look really haggard. I've always shown a lot of fatigue in my face. It's kind of amazing. Like when I look back at pictures, from like 6 to 10 years ago when I was in the throes of Reds, I look like a different person. Like I just look horrible, and I can see echoes of that when I'm under too heavy of training load now. Like beyond just huge bags in my face and gaunt cheeks and stuff, I just start to look really, really rough. And my parents love to point that out. Like they're right on that when I'm starting to look bad. Weight's also a really good thing. So for years recovering from that disordered eating, I found kind of stepping on the scale sort of triggering. But more recently, I realized I just had to do it. So I basically got a Wi-Fi connected scale, and every morning I step on that. And I'm not like obsessing over the number every day trying to micromanage it. It's more just looking at trends. So in the past, like the training load elite triathletes are under, if I'm even running a deficit of 500 calories a day, which is unnoticeable for me, I can easily drop a pound a week. And so when I was only weighing myself once every 2 weeks or once a month, sometimes I get the shock when I step on the scale and realize I dropped 2 or 4 pounds or something, which I absolutely couldn't afford to lose. So this way, I can kind of keep my finger on the pulse of that and make sure I'm staying on top of fueling. Because I've always felt like for me, maybe I messed up my appetite during all those years of under eating, but I've always felt like my appetite's a couple sizes too small for my activity level. You should see these guys are eating dinner right now, like Jackson and Taylor. It's kind of insane how much they can eat compared to me.
So I have a question for you about routine. This is something that I came across when I was looking at your blog, and something that really resonated as part of what we're hearing from athletes right now who are struggling with kind of the shakeup in routine. And the way that that's manifesting for a lot of people is through difficulty sleeping. And I think that for a lot of folks, that's because they are, really struggling with the way that like work and life sort of bleed together right now, or they're watching their screens too often, or they're like, eating very close to bed and like getting some heartburn has been something I've heard before. So I know that routine for you for sleep has been something you talked about. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's something I've struggled with a lot. So I've had insomnia on and off pretty chronically over my entire adult life. It kind of started in university, and it forced me to become like extremely meticulous about sleep hygiene. So there's probably a list of a dozen things I do that I'd recommend to any athlete, and I might as well rhyme them off, I guess. So like basically my bedroom is like a sensory deprivation chamber. I have double blackout curtains and blinds. I've got a white noise machine, which is about the best $50 I've ever spent in the sport. I have a sleep mask. I have earplugs. I've tried weighted blankets. That was kind of a dead end for me. Really, really nice bedding, really nice mattress. That's all important. Um, but I would say one of the most important things is just respecting the sanctity of your bedroom as a place for sleeping, not for work. So no desk in the bedroom, and I'd even go further and say no devices in the bedroom. So I always make a point of these days turning off my phone at the end of the workday. So usually 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. at the absolute latest, and giving myself preferably a couple hours before bed with no screens. And it's amazing, like even other elite athletes I see like, on their phone in bed and stuff. That's just such a terrible habit. There's just like, I think it doesn't matter what you're doing on your phone. It's just an inherently overstimulating device, I think. So I really think the bedroom at least should be a tech-free zone. And even leading up to bed, I think it's a minority of people that can actually handle devices before bed. A lot of people think they can, but I think you'd be amazed if you did an experiment for a week and ditched your devices before sleep time, how much better you sleep. So I find like often if I'm on my phone late, I might be able to fall asleep, but the way it manifests is like I'll wake up early in the morning, which isn't very helpful if you're trying to get a good night's sleep. So I've also found melatonin to be helpful. I've dabbled in CBD a little bit, didn't notice a big effect. Maybe the dosing wasn't quite right. That's very like on trend right now, but I think it's a little overhyped personally. But I think the most important aspect of sleep hygiene is just managing anxiety, managing devices.
How do you manage anxiety?
Tell us.
Oh, I wish I had a short answer for you there. That's another thing I've dealt with on a chronic basis my entire adult life, basically since I was a teenager. Yeah, it's been, to some extent, I think it's been nice to get perspective that sometimes it's just on a cyclical basis and nothing I can do is really going to affect it. So sometimes just waiting out a cycle where you're really anxious is the only answer, as much as I wish there was a quicker solution. But now that I've been through enough of these cycles, it's like, okay, this too shall pass. This is very bad right now, but I'll move on. But yeah, it's really, really debilitating at times, and I've been pretty public about that. It doesn't help. I think pro triathlon's a fairly high anxiety career. Some people might dispute that because it certainly looks like a glamorous career where you're traveling around in beautiful places and training all day. But the amount we train is actually, I would say, not reducing anxiety. Like a little amount of exercise can be nice and relaxing, but the amount we're training at, the training load we're at, definitely exacerbates anxiety, I think. So you're asking about tells earlier that I'm training too much. That's another one right there, I would say. When mental health is starting to get out of whack, it's not like a definitive smoking gun that I'm overtraining, but it's certainly one among a broader set of metrics I'd look at. And just more generally, I guess that touches on the idea I've kind of gravitated more towards qualitative metrics to determine my readiness to train than quantitative metrics, despite having this reputation for being data driven. So what I mean by that, instead of looking at like heart rate variability, which I've looked at in the past, or or like weight or power test results, or TSS or TCL, any of that stuff. I'm more going to look at like fundamental qualitative questions.
I really want to know the answer to this
I
question.
really hope he comes back.
Cody, you froze.
Tell Jackson to stop playing PlayStation.
Oh wait, you're back. You're back. Can you hear us?
Okay.
you were going somewhere so interesting.
Yeah, you said I really focus on the qualitative aspects of, and then we lost you.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll pick up where I left off. Yeah, Jackson.
Turn off the PlayStation.
I'm on janky cottage Wi-Fi, so that's why here. Yeah, so I was saying, like, despite having this reputation for being data-driven, I'm a lot more inclined at this point in my career to focus on qualitative metrics to determine readiness to train. So instead of looking at, like my TSS or my CCL or my heart rate variability in the morning, which I've done in the past, these days I'd be a lot more inclined to ask myself like fundamental qualitative questions like, how's my sleep? How's my mood? How's my sex drive? How's my appetite? How are the social relationships in my life? And I find that gives me a lot more information and a lot more complete of a picture, a more holistic view of where I'm at, where my readiness to train is at, than pouring over any amount of numbers. And that's been kind of a revelation only in the last couple of years, I would say.
Can you do you do anything like meditation or anything to try to like cultivate that awareness of how you're feeling? I feel like sometimes athletes and coaches are a little bit behind the curve of where the human is in all of the data, and I'd love to know about how you like keep that front and center for yourself. I know we lost you again. Are you meditating right now? there you are. You're back.
I heard meditation. Yes. So I think meditation and mindfulness have become like buzzwords in the athletic community. I think a lot of people pay lip service to those terms and don't really actually practice what they're preaching. And I'm guilty of that as well. So my dad's instructed yoga. He's all about meditation. He's been like drilling that with me forever. And I haven't really listened to him until more recently. So long story short, I don't have like what I'd call a formal meditation practice. I think a lot of people's idea of that, the stereotypical idea is like sitting in a dark room chanting ohms or something. Meditation doesn't have to look like that. So the way I'll tend to practice it, I think it's more approachable. I'll try and take a nap in the middle of the day. Now, I wouldn't conflate napping with meditation, but basically, if you're having a high-stress day and you're training in the morning and you're wound up and you're doing emails and stuff, to be able to reach a point where you can even have a 15-minute power nap in the middle of the day, you have to first kind of put yourself in a meditative state. So I lie there on my back, not even trying to fall asleep necessarily, just practicing deep breathing and stuff, and get myself to the point where I go, okay, now I'm ready to sleep. Now I'm ready to reset my day. And so I found that's really powerful. And even just like some simple breathing exercises, I was amazed at how like impactful it is if you commit to it as a daily practice. And I think I've barely scratched the surface. I think that I'm a big believer. This isn't just hype, meditation and mindfulness. I think that will be one of the next frontiers and eking out even more performance from elite athletes. And I think that's been practiced in some form by the very best in their sport for many, many years. And maybe just hasn't been formally coined meditation or something. So I'm really eager to improve my skills there because I feel like I've just scratched the surface.
So you trained as a scientist, and it seems to me that a lot of your approaches to your own training takes that kind of iterative approach of the scientific method. But at the same time, you found yourself getting more and more away from data. How has your scientific background shaped your approach to triathlon?
That's a really astute observation, Chris. I think you basically hit the nail on the head about the progression of my career there. So at first, I think like armed with this physics degree and having worked in science consulting and stuff and doing like, advanced data analysis, poring over these complicated environmental data sets and stuff, I thought triathlon would just be an extension of the same thing. So initially in my triathlon career, I tracked things gratuitously, like any kind of number I could measure, I was basically tracking in this crazy spreadsheet. And I realized a few years ago getting a lot of actionable information from this. And what I mean by that is like all this data is fascinating. It's curiosity. I can make cool graphs and stuff. But at the end of the day, if I'm not using it to inform my approach or make changes, what am I really getting from this? So to me now, like everything I do is driven by the idea of, is this actionable information? Otherwise, it's not really worth collecting, or could it potentially be actionable in the future? So I've kind of tried to distill things down as much as possible to the basics now. It's a far cry from like this convoluted spreadsheet I had earlier on in my career. So now I'm just focusing on mostly those qualitative metrics. And that said, like within each session, I'm still very data driven. So, when I do have access to a pool, I'm always looking at the pace clock. When I'm doing my hardest run sessions, it's always based on, pacing on the track or my GPS watch. Same with the bike, even more so. It's like very, very power driven. But in terms of like the overarching things, like readiness to train, like periodization, it's more about the qualitative stuff now.
You've brought up the periodization a few times, which I think is something that everybody's interested in. What has worked for you in terms of periodizing a year?
It's a good question. I think it's actually a moving target. So, like, I wouldn't assume that there's some perfect periodization formula for me that I could just repeat. So, I think the most important tool to be good at periodizing is self-awareness and adaptability, to kind of be able to roll with what is inevitably going to be a changing set of circumstances every season. Who could have predicted COVID this year? Who could have predicted the first injury in my career last year? Well, maybe I had that one coming, but there's always curveballs every single year. So I think it's just important to be flexible and adaptable. And like failing to have a periodization plan, that's the problem. I see a mistake a lot of pro athletes make where I think it looks like they're racing impulsively. So they have a really good race or a really bad race. This is often the case. And the knee-jerk response is to go race again right away. I rarely, if ever, do that. It's only paid off in a couple circumstances where I popped in a race last minute and had a result that I expected or was proud of. So I tend to set a plan early in the year for at least the first half of the season and then stick to it pretty religiously. So I'm like in a small minority of pros who will actually announce their season at the start of the year. I could go on another tirade about that. I think it really helps the professionalism of our sport when sponsors and fans and stuff know where the athletes are actually going to be and they're not just like flying by the seat of their pants with racing. But that aside, I think it also serves you well from a periodization standpoint to plan out your season or at least have a loose framework that you're going to operate around. And it's been even more important with Ironman racing. So I've only stepped up to Ironman racing in 2018. I've only raced, well, if you count Kona, 3.5 Ironmans, and I'm still very much figuring that out. My sense is that I'm going to be the kind of athlete who only has 2 or 3 good Ironmans a year. I don't think I'm going to be the Cam Worth style racing Ironman a month all season. But maybe I'd have to do that experiment to be able to say that for sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about your trip to Kona? How was your first experience with that race? That's where I met you. How did it live up to your expectations?
Oh, where to begin? I felt like I was in an altered state of consciousness that whole week, and not really in a good way. Like, speaking of anxiety, I was so wound up that entire week, and we were also this touches on a few things we've already hit on. Like, I was way too skinny there as well. That was just kind of a mistake I made. Like, I didn't have that Wi-Fi scale leading into it, but no excuses. Like, I just wasn't on weight, and I got a little bit sick about 2 or 4 weeks out from Kona, and just dropped a bunch of weight I couldn't really afford to lose. So I did basically everything wrong during the lead up, long story short. So to go back a little further, I think it was 8 weeks before Kona, I had the race of my life, broke the course record in Mont Tremblant, won the race, went under 8 hours on a course I didn't think it was possible on, was on cloud 9 basically, and then managed to systematically fuck up like every single thing leading into Kona. And what really kills me is that I heard everything I needed to hear leading into that race. Like, I had all the wisdom passed on to me by all of these wonderful mentors and people around me, like Coach David, other pro athletes who I talked to. But, the stubborn scientist in me had to trial and error it out for myself, I think. So I really can see why it takes a lot of athletes, the majority of athletes, if not all, multiple attempts to get Kona right. There's just so many unique variables there that are special to that race that you have to experience in person. And I think chief among them is just the pressure cooker experience there. Like, if you're one of the 50 or so odd men and women that qualify for Kona, like, everyone wants a piece of you. So one of the things I struggled the most with is that, so Thorsten, the tri-statistician, he had me ranked at a like unbelievable 6th going into Kona. And it's just a stats ranking. It's not definitive, obviously, but I was being named in the same breath as like multiple Kona veterans as a podium threat. And so people were coming up to me, even in my small city, Guelph, and like just taking by the hands and saying like, I just know you're gonna win this year, or you're gonna come like podium or something. And it was absurd. I was like, this is my first Kona attempt. I wanted to say, can you cut me some slack? I just wasn't ready. So despite that being like such positive energy they had to give me, I think I internalized it in a really negative way. And I just read that as like pressure and expectation. So I just felt crushed leading into that race. I would do a lot of things differently next time around.
What are some of those things?
I think I need to get more comfortable saying no. So I'm like a pretty inherently people-pleasing kind of person. It's hard for me to say no to sponsors. It's hard for me to say no to media and stuff. And I had like more commitments lined up than pretty much anyone else that week. So I observed like some of the best pros there. You don't see them all week. And as much as you want to, service existing relationships and get your name out there and stuff, it's a bit of a trade-off, I think. So I think I'd hedge my bets a little bit better. I wouldn't, peace out for the whole week and say screw you to everyone, but I would balance things a little bit better, be more comfortable saying, nope, today I need to just do my own thing and not be in front of anyone. I think it also is tough. Like I'm a pretty introverted guy, and I can fake it with the best of extroverts for a weekend, but maybe not like 7 to 10 days leading into a race of that magnitude. So that was one take home. I think also, like, I wouldn't approach it that differently from, Mont Tremblant. Like, my game plan, my periodization plan, returning to that concept, was that I'd go into Tremblant with kind of, like, 3/4 effort, I'd call it. Not 3/4 training load, but, like, leaving out that last 25% of really miserable, tough stuff that's going to make me hard enough to do well at Kona. And, like, that idea that I had of 75% prep, that led to, like, the best performance of my career. One, I'd be fortunate to top again. So there's a lesson there. Maybe my idea of what 100% focus and prep looks like is really not optimal. And that's kind of like a hardening thing to think of. Like, wait, you're telling me I don't have to crush myself and go full tilt in order to perform my best? Like, that would sure be a nice discovery. So I think just in general, I'd be a little bit more laid back about the entire thing, if that's even possible.
Can you give us a sense of what that 3/4 training, like what that means in a nuts and bolts kind of way?
Yeah. So I crunched the numbers both years. I won Mont Tremblant back to back, 2018 and 2019. The first year, I think I averaged about 19 hours of training, just under 20 hours during the 12 to 16 weeks lead up. The following year, when I went, I think 12 minutes faster or something like that, under 8 hours, I actually trained 17 hours average volume over the 16 weeks prior. So to me, that was a pretty shockingly low amount of volume for an Ironman performance like that. And I was actually dealing with the first injury of my career, an Achilles tendinosis issue that had kind of been niggling for a long time and then reached a head earlier in the season. And so I was only running about half training load, only about 50K a week, like a couple runs a week. So I'd literally, during a couple of weeks leading up to it, I'd do like a 40 or 50K run day and then only run one other day of the week. And I ran a 2:42 marathon there, the fastest I've done. So there were some lessons there. Like I was able to shift a lot of volume onto the bike. And I normally wouldn't ride over 10 hours a week on the bike. I was riding 12 to 15 hours a week with lots of intensity on the trainer and stuff. And that was able to kind of pick up a lot of the slack from the reduction of my run volume. So that was a cool lesson. But just in general, I think like I often would kind of beat up on myself. You hear all these pros talking about their 30+ hour training weeks and stuff, and it's partly mythology. I think there aren't truly a lot of pros consistently averaging, 25 to 40 hours a week of training, like you hear in interviews. But I think also I'm on the low end of responders to volume, so I respond better to a lower volume, and I just need to be confident in that. And having talked to and seen some training plans of other pros, guys like Tim Reed, I'm in pretty good company. Like there's quite a few guys maybe aren't as vocal about it who are training under 20 hours a week average who are far better than me. So I think I just need to have more faith in that's the right approach.
I think it takes people a lot of time to recognize that about themselves. It's a really important thing to learn. That's awesome. Very cool.
I think so, yeah. And I would love to call out other pros just to see people be more honest in interviews. I think when people are asked how much do you train, there's kind of a need to it's a bit of a pissing match. There's a need to insist that it's a full-time job somehow. So I might only train 20 hours a week. There's Jackson Laundry. He trains.
Hi, Jackson.
Yeah. Celebrated Canadian professional triathlete and multiple 70.3 champion Jackson Laundry.
Welcome to detention, Jackson.
Thank you for dropping in. We will hit you up later to invite you to detention.
They said you guys are going to be on the show later.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, we would
Yeah.
love to have you.
We won't
Please.
interrupt him now. We know what
Hi, Taylor.
That's awesome.
Yeah, they're keeping me accountable. I might actually train over 20 hours this week due to their influence.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was really stoked to see on your blog about the anatomy of an Ironman win is that you actually posted that chart in Training Peaks which shows your average hours. And Molly and I talked to our athletes a lot about this. I think that people tend to over remember the big weeks. Like the fact that you did a 20-hour and 1 minute week once becomes like your training average. And I'm like, you have a tool that tells you exactly what your training average is. And, and so often, I mean, even in my highest periods of training, it's always interesting to go in there and find that it's very often 3 to 4 hours lower than I think that I would remember it as.
You're spot on. The joke is your average training week is your biggest swimming plus your biggest bike week plus your biggest run week, and then add in your lawn mowing and your massage time and your dog walking, and then you get your training week. It's not representative. I think people do a bad job crunching averages in their mind, so training peaks helps with that.
Yeah.
It's an emotionally big week. So we have another question for you about data, and I know that this is something that is not all that drives your training, but Chris and I love data as well. So one of the charts that you included in your blog about the anatomy of an Ironman win has a graph with power zones, and it displays your total training time, and then it has the zone 2 power on the bike is almost 100% of the work that you did. And that's something that we've gotten a lot of questions from our athletes and some resistance from athletes about spending time in that zone specifically and not in the much higher, closer to VO2 max or threshold area. Can you tell us a little bit more about that role in your training?
Absolutely. So that is, as you saw, the bulk of my training still. And that intensity distribution would be a lot more difficult to hit if you're riding outside. Not impossible, but I figure if I'm going to be on the trainer, I don't want to ride a 20-hour week on the train, as much as I love my grungy basement. So I want to make the most of my time, and the way to do that is zone 2. We were talking about people training 30-hour weeks. I too could train 30 hours a week if I noodled around in zone 1 for 10 hours on my bike. But what if I could get that same training load with 5 hours of zone 2? It's not totally apples to apples comparison, but by and large, in terms of kilojoules or training stress or however you want to look at it, it's not a bad equivalency, I'd say. So I prefer to spend a lot of my time in zone 2 and free up other time in my life to eat, to sleep, to do other stuff, to work on my house, to spend time with people I care about. It's obviously not quite that simple, but I think for me, it's very good bang for your buck without getting into that awkward kind of sweet spot tempo zone that I used to do a lot of in the past, but that I've since learned is not so productive. I think if you're just using TSS to evaluate your progress, you can gravitate towards doing a lot of zone 3 type work, because it's easy to accrue a lot of training stress in that zone. But I just didn't really see a lot of benefit from that. And I have a lot of data to support that going back to my misguided self-coaching days 10 years ago. So for me, the right formula has been a lot of zone 2 with a smattering of very high intensity, even above race pace, so zone 5, zone 6. So it's only in the couple weeks leading into races, typically, maybe a month leading into a really important race, where I'll spend significant time in race-specific intensities like zone 3 and zone 4 or tempo and threshold. So that's a formula that works for me. It might not be for everyone, but I mean, look, it's allowed me to ride probably an average over the course of a year of 6 or 7 hours on the bike, peaking out at 12 or 15, I think, when I was injured. And I'm riding pretty well. I'm keeping up with guys who are allegedly riding 20 hours a week on the bike. So I think it's a system that's working.
I mean, you've basically described the kind of the polarized model that's sort of gotten really popular in recent years, but you've been doing it for longer than that.
So you're spot on. I get that question a lot. I often get pigeonholed as polarized training. I think strictly speaking, there's different definitions out there. Polarized training is more often a lot of zone 1 with a lot of that high intensity I talked about, or a smattering of it, like zone 5, zone 6. I would say this is a polarized model adapted man training, or adapted to a crunch training load. So I think polarized shows up a lot in studies they've done of, say, professional cyclists training 30 hours a week when they can do a ton of time zone one. It's a bit of a stretch to call it polarized what I'm doing, but in the sense of the word, like the, I guess, more broader sense of the word, it definitely fits the idea of being polarized. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. I mean, the guy who came up with it mostly trained skiers, and their event is like 75 minutes. So, like there's going to be a bunch of lower than you're doing, and then like insanely high intensity because skiers are bonkers. But like, I think when you adapt it for an Ironman, it kind of has to gravitate a little bit in from those poles.
Yeah, exactly. It's like it's been compressed a little bit. Like my idea of, Jackson and I did a track workout the other day on the track, and we were kind of laughing at the idea that our high intensity at 70.3 in Ironman guys is like 70-second quarters, which is kind of 5K pace. But if you're training for an 8-hour event, 5K pace is pretty polarized, right? I don't need to go out and do 100-meter sprints a lot of the time, although I'll still include stuff like hill sprints when I'm, very, very early in my periodization plan.
Yeah, it's one of those like even the fastest people at 70.3 and Ironman, like if we're talking about the individual sports, it's not really fast.
No,
Like if you were to
shockingly
talk to,
slow.
yeah, like a runner or a cyclist or a swimmer, they're like, oh no, that's just a normal training room.
Yeah. It's kind of it always amazes me, even at the most elite level, how like shockingly mediocre triathletes are at all three disciplines, but also how shockingly hard it is to be mediocre at three disciplines at once.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
we're not even sub elite at any of the three. Maybe cycling, the best triathlon cyclists are sort of sub elite at cycling, but it's like running and swimming. It's a joke compared to the gulf between where the best are and where pro triathletes are.
yeah, yeah. You have to be like a regional talent in three sports, which is pretty hard.
Yeah, I just did a 20-minute power test and had a good result, and I was feeling good about it. I looked it up, and I'm like, oh, I could be, according to the celebrated power tables that everyone holds as the gospel, I could be like a mediocre domestic pro cyclist. But wait, I'd have to know how to sprint and handle my bike, and not just have a good threshold.
Right. And you're
So
going to
that
be
wasn't as encouraging.
and you'd be wildly underpaid to do that.
I'm still
Yeah,
waiting to
and
like
then not to
nudge
mention I
up
crashed
into
out
the
half the
bars.
peloton.
What's your dream race? What's the race that you wanna kick off the bucket list?
Oh, Roth is bound to happen one of these years. So
Oh,
I was supposed to
totally.
race in 2019, and then had that injury and had to pull the plug. And I was supposed to race this year, and of course, pandemic hit. So that one, I hope it happens one of these years.
I think one or two last questions. We'll check chat here, but you've been really forward about talking about like disordered eating and some upheaval in your life and insomnia and anxiety and your role in the LGBTQ community. You've articulated like a lot of things that you've been through. What is kind of your process for dealing with obstacles in your life?
Get really anxious, don't sleep for a month, and then talk it through with my boyfriend. I don't know. I don't have a fixed process. I think one regret is that I didn't seek out professional therapy when things were at their worst. And I think often when things really aren't going well, you don't have the energy to put things in place like that. And I guess the catch-22 is when things are going well, you feel like you don't need any help. So you can only lean on the people around you. Like I'm fortunate to have a tremendously supportive partner and parents and stuff, but it's not fair to lean on them really heavily if I'm struggling with anxiety or depression or other mental health issues and stuff. So I regret not having sought therapy, especially during university when I was really struggling.
I think that's something that's important
Yeah,
for
go
a
ahead.
lot of athletes. Yeah, and thank you for talking about your experience with that. I think it's something that people see pros as having things so easily. So that's I think that's hugely important for people to hear that that it hasn't always been easy for everyone, and that everyone deals with this like relationship with perfectionism and like trying to be the ultimate athlete. So I really appreciate you sharing that with the folks out here.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's I'm glad now that the conversation around that's a lot more open, especially among men, than it was 10 years ago. We still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But I've certainly been helped along by other people talking about it so openly. And yeah, you struck on another point, like dealing with perfectionism. That's been such a double-edged sword and such a theme throughout my entire life. Like it's driven a lot of my proudest accomplishments, and also been a source of a lot of anguish and stuff and a lot of difficulties in my life. So triathlon's been an ongoing exercise and learning how to channel perfectionism in productive ways, and learning how to control perfectionism and not let it control me, vice versa, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I couldn't pick a better sentiment to go out on. I hope that everybody out there really heard that last bit, because I think that you're right. This is a sport that we do allow ourselves to focus on that too much. But Cody, thank you so much for taking this time. I know that it is getting on towards. It's hard to believe that it's 9 p.m. It looks like it's like 3 in the afternoon there.
The sun's almost setting here.
Wow. But thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's always a blast to talk to you. And thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. You guys had some great questions, and hopefully got some new answers out of me. It broke the tired old interview script, so I had a lot of fun.
Good.
It was great to have you. I think it's just super important that everybody in chat is sending their love. So thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody out there for coming and spending an hour with us in detention, where we think about what we've done.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Hope to see you guys at races again before long, if those ever happen again.
Someday we will all be able to race again. So for those of you that are going to join us again in the future, don't forget to come back tomorrow morning for Amy BT Yoga at 6:30 a.m. And then right back here Thursday morning, 6:30 again for our weekly Zwift ride. Remember, you have to friend me and Molly on Zwift. Both, not just one of us, if you actually want to get invited to the ride. But until then, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Cody. And here's to a happier and faster tomorrow.
Thanks, guys.